at both Georgia Tech and Emory University. I understand she has an appointment that has her officially at both places. She's a professor in biomedical engineering. She was trained originally as an engineer and got interested in neuroscience, and works, as the title suggests, on neuromechanics of sensory control. So, Lena,
all right.
turn it over to you.
Great. Okay. I want to thank the organizers for having me here. And sounds very loud to me.
Perfect. Yeah.
Perfect? Okay, wow. Okay.
You like it loud.
You like it loud. And I study neural control of movement. And I wanted to talk a little bit about, give you some background and what I'm really interested in, which is the interaction between the nervous system and the body that it controls. And this is a two-way interaction. I have task-specific plasticity here because the brain changes the body and the body changes the brain. So a little bit about what I'm interested in first. I study as a model of sensorimotor control, the control of balance. So this center panel is what, oops, I'm gonna go back. I'm pointing at the wrong place, okay. So this center panel here has been what I've been studying for a long time, which is how we stand up, which sounds pretty boring, but actually is quite interesting, and involves multiple nested loops and time delays and sort of the mechanics of falling or trying not to fall. From there, we are now expanding sort of down to the level of what is the sensory encoding and neuromodulation that affects the sort of flexibility and richness that we see in the control of balance, both from a multisensory integration side, as well as mostly I focus on the control of the multiple muscles that allow you to stand up. And then more recently, we're also recording from brain potentials during perturbations to balance, looking for signals of error assessment and looking at differences in perception. I study healthy individuals as well as people with disorders of the nervous system that allow us to sort of do natural experiments on what happens when parts of the nervous system fail and the brain and body compensate for that. So the primary paradigm that I use is putting animals or people on a moving platform and just pulling the rug out from under them. Okay, so you can see I've done this to cats, to a person, and we have, I think these all run automatically, some musculoskeletal simulations of this. Okay, sorry, that is, volume does not need to be, okay, so the volume's off. That's a baby flamingo. We did not perturb the flamingo, but we had an interesting paper about how they stand on one leg. Principles, we've identified sort of generalized principles about how these diverse behaviors work, and they also generalize to sort of walking. I don't know how to turn that volume down. Walking, and do I have a, it's through the HDMI, and that's why I think, there we go. We can stop this one, because it's going to go forever. And those principles extend to more challenging behaviors of walking. This is a ballet dancer from the Atlanta Ballet walking across a beam. And this is a Georgia Tech student doing the same thing, but not very well. So I'm interested in the diversity of all these things and what are the binding principles for how these behaviors are achieved. Okay, so I don't know how to turn the volume off. There's no more volume. Okay. So I became interested in a movement as an undergrad, but I was a mechanical engineer, so I really cared about how we move from a mechanical standpoint. And so, depending on who you ask, a neurobiologist will say that the brain controls the body. A biomechanist will say, well, the body has its own dynamics, and brain can only make suggestions. And just to highlight what the differences in these ways of thinking are, from a neuroscience perspective, you have like a huge brain and neural apparatus, and I'm going to make a decision to move. Then I'm going to activate all of these things. Whoops, I don't like this. This is backwards. Okay, all of these complex neural circuits downstream, and then we move. And most neuroscience studies, at least when I came into the field, ended with looking at the electrical patterns of motor neuron activity and inferring a movement. Okay, I came at it from the opposite direction, where I saw these really awesome passive walking machines that appear to walk with this has no actuation, and it just walks down a slope. So it can transform gravitational potential energy into a motion that looks a lot like human walking. And so I thought, if we could just understand these very complex mechanics, then we should understand how the brain controls walking. Okay, so maybe that was a bit naive, but which it was. But two interesting viewpoints that I would like to sort of bring together. And I was talking to Andy Ruina, who is a theoretical mechanics person who studies a lot of movements, and he said, well, this mechanics is hard and the control is sort of trivial, and so it's not interesting. Now, he has 10 years later recanted, and now he thinks that control is everything. And I said, but Andy, why is it that so first of all, this thing to walk is making it walk is really hard. Okay, you got to get the mechanics right, and then it's like 1,000 trials of getting the initial conditions right, and then if you blow on it, it falls over. Okay, so. And I said, why is it that if I saw you, even if you had the same biomechanics, that I would be able to recognize the way that you walk from across the quad? And even if your evil doppelganger had the same biomechanics, I probably would be able to tell the difference. And this is one of those sort of unanswered questions. And he said, I'm going to show you something. It's going to change your life. But what it was an simulation from a computer scientist, Karen Liu, who's fortunately now at Georgia Tech, who did some recordings of people moving and then did some inverse optimization, extracted some parameters of how you might control joint torques differently, and then synthesized new movements that were not actually measured. And so I don't know what happens if I do this. Point at the computer. Nope, that's not it. And she was able to pull out, synthesize movements with different movement styles.
As a result, they swing their right arms much less than
mute
before.
that?
The character also
My
moves to the
computer's
left to
mute, but I
counteract the
can't
weight.
mute the volume
However,
on
each
the.
character has a different strategy to deal with the extra weight.
Sorry.
For
Well,
example, the
I'm going to
sad
have to talk
character
over
carries
that.
the suitcase in
But
front of the body.
so when
while
they
the happy
recorded
character
people
swings the
walking sad or
suitcase
happy,
back and
they were not carrying a weight, and then she was able to synthesize people walking sad or happy with a weight, and you could see that this thing is executed in different ways, just because I put some constraints in how the torques at the joints were actually put together, and based on some of the work we've done, even for predicting how patients move, it's now been shown to be important to actually consider individualized patterns of movements, which is to say there is not the way that we walk, okay? So if we're looking for the pattern of muscle activity, we're not going to find it, and that's in fact what we see. We talked about variability a lot. So this is, I put up a bunch of papers that people may be interested in, but this Hillel Scheel has been very influential in my thinking, where the adaptive behavior that we see really emerges from these interactions between the brain, the body, and the environment. And one of the things we've seen over there's the vast complexity of the nervous system and the redundancy. And what happens is, mainly when we simulate the body and the environment, it doesn't look at all like what we do when we walk. Basically, you try to run simulations and it basically crumbles and it falls down. Okay, same thing with neural systems, most of the time they don't, if you don't have the parameters right, they don't act like biological systems. And what we find though is that, there's a huge set, like if we actually specify behavior, we can actually reduce the set of sort of behaviors or solutions that we see that are sort of neuromechanically feasible that could produce a behavior. But then when we look at each individual at each instance in time, we're actually going to see one of many possible solutions. And that's been seen, we see it in the mechanical system, and this has been known in neural systems where Astrid Prins did a sort of a brute force sweep of parameters in a very simple circuit here for digestion in a crab, and found that you could get good enough behavior from lots of different parameters. And also this idea that if I took the average set of conductances from a neuron and put it into a model, that it wouldn't actually spike, but if I took the very specific numbers that I got from each animal, then it actually would produce behavior. So the structure and the relationships between all of the parts that we see matter, both at the neural level and at the musculoskeletal level. So there's all kinds of behaviors we can do, but we don't do. And one of the things that was very influential for me when I actually was an undergrad here at Berkeley working with Bob Full, and we were studying cockroach locomotion. And what he found was that there's sort of you can have a 2, 4, 6, or 8-legged animal and come up with a basic principle about how it moves, and come up with this template of a spring and a mass model for coordinating the limbs. And it turns out that the 2, 4, 6, or 8 legs of these animals look very similar, and the overall ground reaction forces look the same. And that Mark Rabert was actually using these principles to make robots that moved. And if he could figure out how to do it with 1 leg, then he could do 2, and then he could do 4. And he, of course, as the founder of Boston Dynamics, and they make the most versatile robots arguably out there. Unfortunately, we don't know what the secret sauce is in his robots. So, but this is something that very much stuck with me, of how do we find generalizing principles to coordinate all of these objects, all of these body parts to achieve similar goals. And that led me down the path where what I study now is these principles of hierarchy and modularity in sensory motor control, which I say are necessary for robustness, for flexibility, and that necessarily lead to the fact that we are all slightly different from each other. So I'll talk about this a little bit more. So so I have 3 parts to talk. First,
do you see individuality as something that is a byproduct of other things, or is it an evolutionary, really interesting trait?
Byproduct meaning, so I think that individuality comes from a number of adaptive processes on different time scales across evolution, across your lifespan, and even from moment to moment when we perform tasks. And I'll explain that a little bit more, but at the end. Okay, so, all right, so first I'm going to try and make a case that sensory motor control is sort of a very canonical decision-making process that nervous systems do that can provide insight for other things that we think are more abstract, like cognitive tasks, because in general, you're trying to achieve some goal, and more importantly for brains, trying to coordinate a system in different ways to do different tasks. So you have one system, and you want to be a generalist, right? So, and then I'll talk sort of a background, sort of a historical look at hierarchical neural systems for control of movement. And since I'm interested in gait, we'll focus on locomotion and balance. And then I'll tell you a little bit about some of the research that we've done on these sort of what happens when you look at the nervous system interacting with the body, and how some principles of modularity become important to facilitate the robustness of our movements. Okay, so first, I think, why do we have brains? If you want to, you can look at this video from Dan Walpert, who says that brains are just there to make us move, and in a approximate sense and in a distal sense, we see nervous systems evolve when animals have to move, and this is the tunicate. This is like this sea animal has 100 neurons, so it's actually less than C. elegans, and then it has to swim around in this environment, unmapped environment, and find a place to land, and it has to sense the environment and make decisions. And then when it finds a place, it sits and attaches to a rock, and the neurons responsible for it swimming around disappear. They're digested. It does still have neurons to allow it to feed, and in fact, we also have lots of neurons in our gut that allow us to move food around and digest. And that's pretty, I'm not going to really talk about it, but you can look up the little brain. But what is similar about sort of a motor, what do I call a decision? And ultimately, if we're going to do neural processing, it's to make decisions about what we should do. We have to interpret ambiguous sensory information. Since the same input was always needed to produce the same output, you would just build it into a mechanical system because neurons are costly and slow. You have to coordinate multiple body parts in different ways. Again, if it was just a mechanism that worked, then I would just build a mechanism to do that, and I wouldn't have to have a nervous system. And then for adaptability, you can weigh different costs and constraints at different times and adapt. That allows you to adapt to different behavioral contexts. And it's just that when we look at movement, we think of it as very objective and physical, and that there must be a solution. I spent the first half of my career trying to find that solution, and I could not find it. I'm still convincing my field that it's not, objective. And you could argue that everything else also in some way results in a movement, like cognitive, emotional, brain function, escape, right? Escape induces fear and helps you run away from things faster. And you'll see that very simple animals have very complex structures, like a flea, just releases energy in its leg, but its leg can only jump. And so those types of animals tend to have very simple command neurons that just evoke a behavior, but they're not very, very flexible. So there's decisions to be made both on the sensory side, the motor side, and then what should I be doing right now? All right, so this is a paper that came out and I guess caused some hullabaloo at cosine this here, but neuroscience needs behavior, and they here represented what Wolfgang presented yesterday, this idea from Marr that there are three sort of levels that we can think about animals moving or brains functioning, which is what's the problem that you're trying to solve, what are the rules, and then what's the implementation. And so we really need to think about a behavior and what are we trying to why are we spending all this energy making neurons fire? And then are there principles, because these implementations tend to be slightly varying from one person to the next, one animal to the next. So getting these principles in the middle is really important. All right, so I'm now going to give you an example of we've talked about the cortex a lot, and I'm going to talk about what the cortex is not needed for. This is a very, you might say, this is a spinalized frog, and it has to make a motor decision of how should I move my limb. And you can do an experiment where you put a piece, a little acid or irritant on the skin. And so this is the spinal cord, so it's detached from the brain. And what you'll see happen is that the leg will go over there and just wipe the skin. You're like, okay, well that's like a reflex. That's simple enough. But you can start the limb from different places, and it always goes to that point. Okay, so now that's like completely different muscle activation patterns, which means different motor neurons are active, and you can extrapolate that up the chain. And if I can restrain the hind limb here, then the front leg will go and wipe that spot. Okay, and then if you constrain both of these, then the leg from the other side will come over and wipe that spot. So this is one of the things that I can't understand it. That the spinal cord knows what it's supposed to do. It has a goal, and it can do it very creatively based on what's available to it and what its conditions are, right? So it has to have knowledge of itself. Now, so somehow there's this abstract goal that's encoded in the nervous system, and then there's lots of different ways that you can generate that movement. And I'll just say that in general, people in motor control tend to study things at this task level, like they'll study reaching, and we hit the target or we don't hit the target, and we hit the target this many times, and it follows an optimal control rule or Bayesian inference or something like that. And then the other people tend to study, well, the left deltoid went on, and then the right biceps, and then we can describe these very detailed patterns of movement. But where the magic occurs is where these things interact with each other. How do we go from here to here, I think, is the challenging problem that sits in the middle here of that I think could use a computational hand. Another example, quickly, is here's a cockroach, and it doesn't even have a brain. It's very distributed processing. And generally, when it walks, these three legs make a tripod, and then it alternates with the other three legs. And then because the iCook doesn't govern cockroach experiments, you can rip off the middle two legs, and then it kind of it can't really walk, but it actually immediately changes gait patterns to using the opposite legs. Okay, so I don't know how that decision is made either, but it's very clear that the animal has motivation to run somewhere, whether it's going towards food or escaping something else.
So it learns essentially if you cut those things that...
I wouldn't call it learning. I think it's emergent. It's just sort of, and I don't know if it's because there's no feedback from the limbs, I don't know, but it doesn't really take time for that to happen.
It is completely normal after.
Yeah, I mean, like if I put a knee brace on you, or you put on ski boots, it's not like you can't walk anymore, right? Or if you get hurt, you limp. And so we're able to rapidly change our behaviors.
Does it work like that when it has the middle feet sometimes?
Sorry?
Does it work like this when it has all the feet? Sometimes?
Oh, so you're saying in its natural life, does it do this? It's possible, when you go over different terrains, or you might miss a step, that these types of gait changes are necessary. So yeah, it could be that, and it could be that it needs to feel the ground before it'll change gaits or something like that. Okay. But these are so behaviors that I think that are simple enough for us to actually say, are they successful or not? But they're still really challenging to understand how that might happen. And it's so challenging that I don't, we're getting to the point where we can start to simulate these things. I don't know if you guys have tried QWOP. You can go to the web and try this, where you hit QW, OP, and you try to make this thing run. And the only thing that it does is it changes the hip and the knee angles. And this is the best one ever that somebody's recorded. I couldn't even get it to take one step. And I study biomechanics. So, Yep.
For the cockroach example, what happens if you do some asymmetric changes?
Yeah, so you get different patterns. So you can take out one leg. Yeah, it'll adjust. Yeah. And I'll say the cockroach system is very distributed, more distributed than our system. So there's ganglia, and then there's like a head ganglion. And then the stick insect, which a lot of people have studied, is even more decentralized than a cockroach, mainly because it's really static, whereas a cockroach is very dynamic. They, they're in your house, but you can't see them because they run so fast. And so they might need more central coordination between the legs. But the stick insects tend to be sort of more of a peripheral coordination. All right, so, so one of the reasons it's hard is because our bodies can do lots of different things, and so we have to coordinate them very precisely to do the things that we want, and it's really not that easy to do. This is just a toy video. We were just playing around with trying to do some reinforcement learning with a musculoskeletal model to get it to walk, and these are the different iterations of reinforcement learning algorithm where it can't stand and then it falls. And it knows nothing about the fact that it's just trying to go as far as possible. It doesn't know anything about rhythmicity or that it should be symmetric or anything like that. And so that's where you can compare that to, yep.
Do you have any comment in terms of like intuitive physics? Like if a baby learning to walk is probably that uncoordinated, but over time you kind of gain some
That's right.
physics and then
Yep.
leverage that.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any comment about that?
Yeah, I do. So we have innate patterns. Actually, I have some stuff at the end, but I'll just tell you right now that babies can kick, and actually the kicking in the womb is actually very important for them to establish the ability to do these flexion and extension movements. And when they come out, they have to learn how to sit up, then they have to learn how to stand, and then once they can do that, they can walk. So they're actually reducing the degrees of freedom of the body. And in fact, you can see kids with cerebral palsy who haven't learned that when they reach, that they should stabilize their body. And so they fall. And then if you stabilize their trunk, then they're able to reach. So it's like how many degrees of freedom can you coordinate at one time is a challenging problem for movement. And then we start with some bits, and then they have to get adapted to what our current biology is, so, or my environment, right? So if I got born on Mars, then it would be slightly different. All right, so that's hard for us to control a model, to do simulations of it walking. Most of the biomechanical simulations are not really simulations, they're just sort of recapitulations of what we measured. And you can compare that to Mike the Headless Chicken, who is a chicken. You can go to miketheheadlesschicken.org, but chickens run with their heads cut off. This one actually was in the 40s and lived for many years and grew and pecked around and did all the things a chicken does. Chicken doesn't have a very large cortex, but its behavioral repertoire was in fact intact. And how does that happen? Which gets me to sort of a basic primer on movement control and the hierarchical systems that allow us to move. All right, and the main idea is that we have parallel pathways that allow us to compute on increasingly abstract goals to achieve movement. So when I'm, you all walked here, and you weren't having to do co-op. You weren't having to think about when your ankle muscles went on and your toes and things like that. And probably you were like on the phone or texting and doing some very high level thing that your cortex should be doing and not thinking about all the things that you don't want to. And in fact, when people have neurodegenerative disorders or aging, they lose the ability to walk and talk at the same time. So these things that we shouldn't have to think about, we end up having to think about. And that's one of the indicators that somebody has a balance problem. All right, so this, so broadly, there are, when I teach undergrads, there are 3 categories of movement that we teach. Sort of reflexive down in the spinal cord, what we call automatic movements, walking, breathing, a lot of rhythmic things, which are largely regulated in the brainstem, and then voluntary movement, so all the things that you actually want to think about doing. And breathing and balance are interesting because they're sometimes automatic and sometimes voluntary at some interaction of the two. But the take-home message is that all voluntary movement requires this coordination of all up and down the hierarchy of movement. And so I'll give you sort of an example from my own research in balance control, is that the time difference also matters. So if I put you on my platform here and we pull the rug out from under you, you're going to fall backwards. It takes time for the signals, sensory signals, to actually reach the spinal cord, even more to the brainstem, and even more to the cortex. So if you're falling and you want to respond quickly, then you can't wait for the cortex to respond. And so when we do the perturbations and we look at EMG, so this is electromyography, it's an electrical signal in the muscle, which directly reflects the activity of motor neurons. And Jeff Lichtman showed us very nicely that there's one-to-one organization between the motor neurons and motor fibers, and in fact, the neuromuscular junction is the most reliable synapse. When the motor neuron fires, there is a vesicle released and you get twitch in the muscle. So I have this external indicator of what the neurons are doing, at least at the output layer. Okay. And what we see is that the complexity of the muscle activity increases as time increases, because you've got this loop happening and then this loop happening and that loop happening. And so you're in free fall for 50 milliseconds, which is an eternity for like a robot. And then at 100 milliseconds, you start seeing electrical activity that is really just returning the joint back to where it came from. So it's very local variable, and that doesn't work for that long. So people with Parkinson's have very stiff reflexes, and then they fall backwards like a tree. So at 100 milliseconds, you start seeing a different kind of a response, which actually, as we call the balance correcting response, which you can't look at any single joint and predict what it is, and it really has to do with what direction is my body falling. So that already we're getting to what I would call a more abstract type of goal, and there's many different sets of sensory information that could lead me to believe that I'm falling to the left or falling to the right, and it will evoke, I will show you later, a similar a motor pattern. And then around 200 milliseconds is when, if this isn't working, I might take a step, and so I might change my strategy or reach out my arm. Or something like that. So as we go, we basically have to, let's not fall to the ground while higher centers, are figuring out what we should do. Is there a question?
You have mentioned cerebellum. Isn't it important for balance?
Cerebellum is important. Yes. So the cerebellum is very important for movement, and mostly we think about it adapting movements from one instance to the next. So if I'm doing, and there are indications that if I give you the same perturbation many times, you're going to change your response, and that appears to be cerebellar. It's basically like when you walk, you take the ski boots off, and then you keep doing this, and then it sort of goes away.
You have all these musculoskeletal sensors, but we also have semicircular canals in the ear.
Yep.
That are balance detectors of some kind.
Yeah, it turns out that I have removed the vestibular system of certain animals, and this early response stays. And actually, the vestibular system tends to act like a reference. So if you tilt the animal and then it doesn't get a head signal, we actually showed that they throw themselves the wrong way because they're missing the head movement signal. So for the very fastest ones, we believe that these are proprioceptors from the body, from muscle spindles. And because they're in all the muscles, then you have to kind of interpret them together. There isn't any one signal that's going to tell you which way you're falling.
But when that that system fails, people at least seem to have serious balance
Yes,
deficits.
they do. They have a lot of difficulty stabilizing their head and all kinds of things. But we think it's more because you don't know. So here, look, I'll give you an example. If my vestibular system gets a signal that I'm doing this, then you might say I'm falling forward, but let's say I turn my head and now I'm falling forward. It has to be interpreted in relationship to the position of my body. And so it's that integration that is messed up rather than, you know. There's a question back here.
Sort of about the cerebellum. So you're saying it, just to clarify, it's not part of this cycle that you're studying?
It's, one, it's hard to know. We basically have lesion studies or patients to really tell us. We do know that patients with cerebellar loss are not able to adapt their behaviors to new situations, and they also can't learn their own dynamics very well. So when I move my shoulder joint, then it causes a torque at my elbow, and we compensate for that so I can do something like this. And people with cerebellar loss don't. And so this multi-joint coordination is really important for balance control, and so that is also another reason that the cerebellum is important. Now, I've also lesioned proprioceptive information from animals, and they tend to adopt behaviors that look a lot like cerebellar patients adopting a wide stance and things like that. And there's a lot of sensory information that goes into cerebellum. So it's unclear whether it's the lack of sensory information itself or whether it's the processing of the sensory information that can lead to sort of this similar types of behavior. So it's hard to say exactly what that is. Okay. Let's get time. All right, so this is what we learn in basic motor physiology class, is that there is a muscle spindle in your muscle that responds to stretching of the muscle, and that it projects monosynaptically to the motor neuron and acts like this feedback control system where if I lengthen the muscle, then the muscle contracts and it shortens itself. So it's like a servo. That's what people say. We actually just had a paper saying that the spindles encode force, which is often highly correlated with length. But it's actually quite important in the dynamics of the firing rates and the timing that we get for the muscle spindles. And this diagram is misleading because the same axon also projects to an inhibitory neuron that sort of turns off the muscle that's opposing the movement. So that's it also projects to the other side. It also projects up to the next segment, and it also projects all the way up to the thalamus. So we draw very simplified pictures of these sensory neurons that basically go everywhere. And that information is processed in many different ways at different levels. Okay, so the stretch reflex we see gets activated in the postural response. There are more complex spinal reflexes like flexion withdrawal reflex. If I step on a tack, I'm going to pick up my leg and extend the other one. And then depending on which phase of gait I'm in, the exact activation of those muscles is going to change. Okay, so that's another example of my spinal cord is really modulating itself to achieve a task depending on my current state and my desired state. And then here, the reflexes are then modulated all the time. So why do they tell you to relax when they hit this? Is because if you do other things like count or think or read or clench your muscles, it changes the amplitude of the stretch reflex. So we can usually they get downregulated by cognitive higher level tasks. And in diseases, most neurological diseases they go up, and partly we think that the cortical system has to inhibit a lot of the circuitry in the spinal cord. But this is our first line of defense of just maintaining our postures, coordinating limbs to get away from bad things. And then for walking, you may have heard of the spinal central pattern generator, which is an intrinsic rhythmicity in the spinal cord. Now, spinal pattern generators exist in a lot of different animals that do eating, breathing, swimming, rhythmic things, and in various animals they've found single neurons that have an intrinsic bursting rhythm, pairs of neurons with mutual inhibition that will burst. And while the mammalian spinal cord also has this oscillation, really can't find it in the spinal cord. And it seems to be an emergent property of the various interactions of interneurons and potentially motor neurons in the spinal cord. And so what you do is you can take out the spinal cord of a neonatal rat and bathe it in an MDA and serotonin bath. Serotonin's really important because it increases the excitability of motor neurons. So that's what happens when you come out of sleep paralysis, is that serotonin descends into your spinal cord, and you don't act, well, I would call it acting out your dreams. But when you move, you move. So the reason that you don't act out your dreams when you're sleeping is because the serotonin system is off in your spinal cord. All right. So why we have this? This rhythm also is extremely slow, even though it's oscillating. So it needs sensory feedback to make it sort of at the frequencies we actually see during movement, which is why that interaction with the mechanical system is important. One of the nice things about this organization is if you look at the whole brain all the way down to the spinal cord, is there's a region in the brainstem called the mesencephalic locomotor region, and you can take an electrode and stimulate there. You can apply voltage there, and what happens is that it projects down to the spinal cord and activates these rhythmic circuits. And so it's like a knob on the intensity, the frequency of the oscillations in the spinal cord that cause alternating flexion and extension. And so this is a nice tonic level of activity that then gets translated into rhythmic output. And it's one example of how then the higher center can really just focus on speed and not exactly which muscles they should be activating and when, which is helpful for you walking and texting. So I'm going to show you a movie from the 20s. It's maybe a little gruesome for some of you. That's a cat, a decerebrated cat, so they can live for a long time. This is an animal in a vegetative state, but these are very classic experiments done in the 20s by Graham Brown. And this is a decerebrate cat walking on a treadmill, and you can see that when you change the speed, the circuitry in the brainstem and the nervous system can, in fact, adapt itself to the speed. And this is very vigorous movement and evidence that the locomotor apparatus lives below the cortex. And people have taken this idea that if we wanted to interpret what these neural oscillators are doing, we have to embody them into the dynamics of the body and the environment. Alka Abspheres built a robot that has a bunch of coupled oscillators, and it changes the body's undulations from a standing wave to a traveling wave automatically when the thing enters the water. So that's like a really interesting example of how we could interpret what these circuits are for if we put them in their natural situations.
What again did they do to the cat?
They decerebrated it, so which means that
Just took the entire brain out.
So actually the line's right here. Cut it right here.
So what was left?
It depends on where they do it. And I think if you include what's called a mammillary body, that is a little bit better than if you get posture and you get locomotion. But all the cortices are gone. And the animals are able to live, they were able to keep them alive for years. And
you
it's
have the cerebellum?
Yeah.
And you have the thalamus?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't think so. And certainly, I don't think Mike the Headless Chicken had a thalamus either. Yeah.
So a few slides ago, you had this line at the bottom that spinal reflexes are modulated by context, adaptation, emotion, movement, and cognitive tasks.
Yep.
So it seems fantastic to me. Like, I don't even know how to interpret my own emotions, but you're saying my spinal cord knows how to interpret this. So I was just going to ask, like, how does the spinal cord learn how to deal with any of this very rich cognitive stuff?
So I think, I'll show you in a minute, there are many projections from higher centers to the spinal cord. So we often think about the spinal cord as a relay, but I really think about it as having a lot of different abilities that need to be turned on and off.
But even if it's getting information, how does it get the right training signal to figure out how to interpret this?
But I think a lot of this is innate. There is evidence that the spinal cord can learn, and actually you can train yourself to increase or decrease your reflexes, and this is actually done as a therapy for people with spinal cord injury, and changes the excitability of the neurons and allows people to walk better.
But I mean, beyond just improving my reflexes, you're saying my spinal cord can learn to interpret emotions.
I wouldn't say learn to interpret emotions, but like emotions are pretty fundamental. Like if you're scared, right, then you're going to tense up. You may be more reactive to inputs. And I don't know that that's learned. That's something that can happen. You're right. So the decerebrate cats will exhibit what's called a sham rage. You can poke them and they get mad. But what happens is then they never habituate to that, right? You poke them. If you poke your cat over and over, then finally it's like, forget you. I'm not responding to that. But if you do it to a decerebrate cat, then it just keeps going. So the apparatus is there, and it's a combination of both the neural signals, but also a lot of hormonal signals and neuromodulation as well. So I wouldn't say that it's learned necessarily. Okay, so where are we? So what does the cortex do? This is study from Trevor Drew, where they have an animal walking on a treadmill and then an obstacle comes, and here is the neuron that they're recording from in the motor cortex of a cat, and the lower panels are the muscles that are active. Okay, so when the cat's not stepping over an obstacle, you can see a little bit of firing in this unit. And when it's stepping over the obstacle, you can see that the firing increases, and then when it's no longer stepping, it decreases again. And then you have to think about the amount of time it takes for the signal to go from the cortex to the leg. And so any muscle activity preceding that is not caused by the cortex. And it looks maybe like this activity could be this extra firing that we see in this muscle to help the animal step over the obstacle. So it's sort of adding to what is the nominal steady state pattern that we see when the animal is walking. Okay, so those are the things you want to pay attention to, right? You're going to walk, and then you might trip if you don't see the step. All right, and we have to remember that this idea that they call them motor neurons, upper motor neurons in your textbook. They actually go lots of places. So the pyramidal cells, layer 5. First of all, the projections from the cortex to motor neurons in the spinal cord are mostly indirect and also quite diffuse. So Peter Strick showed through some anatomical studies that there's this idea that there's what they call old M1. So the corticospinal neurons actually project to interneurons in the spinal cord. And then this is also a bad drawing too, because the interneurons project to multiple motor neurons. And then only in primates and in humans do you have this new M1, which is part of the motor cortex that can project to both interneurons and to motor neurons. Okay, so there isn't really a one-to-one between the cells in the motor cortex and the neurons down here. And I might say that actually they should be orchestrating multiple muscles if we want to actually do something useful. They also make pit stops. They have collaterals that can stop in the striatum, the red nucleus, in the, I think, the reticulospinal areas before going to the spinal cord. So it's actually coordinating all of the different levels of the hierarchy. And interestingly, these areas, like the red nucleus, is not that well understood, but it also has a motor map in it. But it's small, and people don't really study it, so we don't know that much about it. Or they don't study it anymore, let's say. So this idea that, this is your classic homunculus picture representation of what the motor cortex does, and it's got a lot of hand areas and facial areas, and this is for manipulation and for speech, and the leg areas are quite small because, as I showed you, most of the things we do there are really to modulate more automatic functions. But this map is sort of a fallacy. It is not like only the thumb gets activated here. When you zoom in, lots of different muscles are activated there, and it's a very fractal type of pattern. And why would that be? So there's ongoing arguments about what the motor cortex does and what it represents. One very intriguing study that I like is, was done by Michael Graziano, which normally he puts electrodes in primates, but this is a computational study. So normally we think about the hand and leg and areas being sort of segregated. That's the cartoon picture, and I should tell you that that's not actually true. They're really overlapping. And so what they did was a very simple study where they observed what monkeys actually do. So they reach and they feed and they fight. And they made a very simple behavioral repertoire consisting of zeros and ones of whether or not certain joints were involved in particular movements. So are there things that involve hand-eye coordination or hand-foot coordination or reaching into certain parts of space? And then they played this repertoire. So they watched the monkey for a day. They played this repertoire into a map that starts like this. This is a Cohonen network. And then put in a simple rule of minimizing the distance between neurons that are firing together. And what emerges are the hand shows up in areas with the torso and the arm, and in areas, other places with only the leg. And a lot of these areas look a lot like what we see in the neuron. In fact, it had two different frontal eye field, so different eye fields. So you use your eyes in conjunction with different parts of the body. And so this is a behaviorally driven map for multi-joint coordination, possibly. And if you change the representation of different behaviors, then you change the maps. And that's consistent with what we know about motor cortex expanding in musicians who spend a lot of time playing the piano, and changing in amputees who lose a limb and who are no longer using that body part. So the parts for the representations for the other areas will expand.
Components or component map. Component map.
Oh, sorry. I actually just copied that from their abstract. I was going to write Cohonen map, and I said I better check that, and that's what they wrote. So, and the other really intriguing finding recently is that you can ablate the motor cortex in a mouse, and it can still do most of the things that it has to do. And Ben Solvetsky did a study where the animals had to press a lever and then wait 17 seconds and press it again before they would get a reward. And the animals actually would, I think, come up with a bunch of superstitions, like I have to do this and scratch my head and then something for 17 seconds to hit the button. So they come up with these very complex and stereotyped routines so they can hit the button and get the reward. And they couldn't learn this when they removed the motor cortex. But if they had learned it before and you remove the motor cortex, they could still do it just fine. So now this idea of maybe the motor cortex is sort of a tutor for movements and isn't actually performing them, but allowing you to assess them and learn them and put new combinations of things together. But I've had an increasing number of people come to me like, well, we took out part of the motor cortex and nothing changed. And you have to remember in rodents that this is a thin, smooth sheet, so it's certainly not as well developed as for a person. And also, mostly they're studying reaching movements in rodents, and I think most of their cortex is for their whiskers, right? So, yeah.
Sorry, so if the motor cortex is training some other part of the brain to execute these motor skills, what other part of the brain would this information be stored in?
Yes, that's what I was.
So remember, there's lots of maps all over, motor maps, and actually like colliculus is a map of extrinsic space. So it's not just in cortex. And one of the things we do know is that when musicians are learning to play the piano or whatever, their motor cortex is activated much more than when things are well learned. Because we don't, and it's a mystery. Where does it go? What's actually controlling the movements? And the other really interesting thing is they can actually, if you're a musician, you can practice without moving your hands, and then you get better too. That's a weird thing too.
You haven't talked about the cerebellum, but that would be a candidate place where the overlearned movements can happen.
That is true, and I don't know enough about the cerebellum to talk about it. You guys keep asking me about it.
Hippocampus interaction is the long-term traces of the original learning
Are
from the motor cortex being removed, and then traces in the hippocampus would hold the learning.
I don't know. This is not my study or area, so I don't think they know either, because these are just behavioral studies where you're doing a lesion, and it's very difficult to interpret lesion studies. But they tell you the necessity of something, mostly because there are also compensatory mechanisms that could happen. So when you have a stroke, you basically often have a hole in your motor cortex.
I wonder if there's a nice database that pretty much has all the possible, all sorts of different lesion data and the behavior results that you sort of observe. That anybody in here knows of something like that?
No, although we had this discussion about how difficult it is to get our data in some form that somebody else can understand it. And this idea that every lab has got a slightly different paradigm, things that they record, electrodes they use, and it's really a problem in neuroscience and in biomechanics.
What you mentioned about the mice, that when they lost their cortex, they remembered about the superstitions. Did the same hold? Do you know if there was studies about the fear response in the decelibate cats, where like you could desensitize the cat? Would that stay if you desensitize the cat, or would it still have the fear response that you were talking about?
Probably if you desensitize the animal and then you remove the cortex, it would probably come back. So a lot of the idea about what the cortex is doing is inhibiting the functions of lower circuits. So when people have strokes and things like that, their spinal cords become hyperactive.
Okay.
Okay, where were we? Oh, good, we were at the end. Okay, great. So, so that's what I mean by here. So the corticospinal system is not just is coordinating multiple levels of the hierarchy to allow movement to happen, and is not necessarily in control moment by moment of what is happening, because it's really slow. Okay. But the fact that you have this hierarchy means that you can think. The reason why we think walking is easy, right? We actually don't have to think about the hard part. Okay, so how can we understand this amazing movement and flexibility that we have? I'm going to talk about some of our research in the neuromechanics and the issue of modularity. So it's just one aspect of modularity, a very first look, very simple idea. So, but again, I studied balance control, and just to convince you, there are lots of ways we can achieve our balance, whether it's taking a step, keeping our feet in place. There's lots of different ways we can move our body to do that. And in our paradigm, we tend to study people just standing there, keeping their feet in place, although we've had them stepping too. So what happens is I look at the readouts of the muscle activity when this happens. If I pull the platform backwards and I fall forwards and I have to activate the muscles on the back of the body. And so this is just to show you that actually the stretch reflex that happens at 50 milliseconds is really small in this particular movement. There are other perturbations that evoke it a little bit more. And then, so the major activity is this brainstem latency movement. So it's an automatic postural response. You cannot suppress it. If I pushed you, I said don't respond, you can't do it. You can reduce it. Okay, so I can change the gain of it voluntarily, but I can't change the actual occurrence of the response.
Do you tell them to keep their feet in place, or what instructions?
It depends on the experiment. Usually you tell them to try and keep their feet in place. Yeah.
So there's probably some top-down.
Yeah, we can, and right, so we can actually perturb them strong enough sometimes where they have to take a step, and we tell them that's okay too. There's also a harness, but we don't use that. We try not to use that. Okay, and so then if I move the platform the other direction, then I get a different set of muscles, not completely, but a different set of muscles activated. Right, and so, and as I said, the evolution and complexity of the response is going to evolve over time as the information gets processed more and more. And this is just to show you that you're not just co-contracting all the muscles. It's within 100 milliseconds, the response is directionally specific, which means that multisensory integration has happened, and I know which way I'm falling. Okay. And then what you do is you can, this is looking down at the top of the person, and you can move in all different directions, and you can get these tuning curves, which neuroscientists love. So if I unwrap to these directions and put them on the bottom, you can see that there are some muscles that are peaking in the backward directions, others in the forward directions, and none of them exactly the same. So we want to look at coordination patterns across these, or how complex the signals are there, and how can we understand the fact that for every degree I'm going to have a slightly different pattern? How does that happen? So I usually talk to not math people, so this might be a little bit boring for you, but if we record 3 muscles, let's say, that have 3 different tuning curves. We used non-negative matrix factorization to look at these patterns and infer sort of the basis functions that might be used to generate those patterns. And so what I might see is that, if there's a neuron that responds to rightward, leftward falling, where I want to then push right, then I would have to say, okay, what muscles do I need to do that? So here we're hypothesizing that there's this module that encodes the relative excitation of different motor neurons in my spinal cord. So muscle 1 might be on a lot, muscle 2 not at all, and muscle 3 about halfway. And what you'll see outside is that you'll have a very strict correlation between these 2 muscles, right? And then, I'm a 3-dimensional person, and so I might also have a diagonal movement. So if I have another neuron that's sensitive to backward falls and where I need to push forward, I have the same set of muscles to do the movement, and so this might activate, we call it muscle synergies or a motor module, where muscle 1's on a little bit, muscle 2 a lot, and muscle 3 about halfway. And so those might simultaneously activate the muscles. So we know motor neurons take lots of inputs from different interneurons and hierarchical systems. And so you'll see this strict coactivation between the muscles, and then when you add them together, then you get, the output that we see. But the idea is that I can take these modules, which I call library of actions, and we can put them together flexibly in different ways, depending on how much I'm falling to the right, how much I'm falling forward. And I can now construct movements based on these. Let's say these are learned actions, so I'm learning them as I'm a baby. I'm learning how to kick my leg to the left or to the right. So question? Okay. So this was done originally. We did it in the cat. And here, these are the muscles that we recorded from in the hind limb. And here are the sort of coordination patterns that we saw that were tuned to the direction of that we pushed them. Right, so this is a fixed sort of pattern, and then this says, okay, for each direction that we push them, how much was it activated? And then I was also able to find a correlation to the output. So I was able to also decompose the forces and say, okay, this set of, this muscle pattern then modulates the magnitude of the downward force. This one modulates the amount of flexion force. Which happens in the opposite direction, so the leg comes up versus down, and this one is sort of forward direction, and this one is in the backward direction. And if you look at the structure of the musculoskeletal system, it makes sense that things are organized like this, and people have done some prediction using energy optimization to say, like, okay, what's the most energy efficient way for me to move my leg in a particular direction? And I might segregate into these parts, but also notice that the same muscles are active in multiple tasks. So if I were just to look at the activity of one muscle or one motor neuron and try to infer what behavior it was, I would not be able to do that. So interestingly, I said, oh, well, we can predict this with energetic optimization. But in fact, we see that each animal has a very specific pattern that they use consistently over multiple conditions. So here's 3 animals, and the red bars are the muscles that we measured in common. We had different implanted electrodes. But you might say, well, it's just this is the module for standing up. So you need the extensor muscles. That's a biomechanical constraint. They all have the quads as the largest muscle. Okay, but this animal here doesn't really have anything else on. The hamstrings are not on. This one has a little bit more. And this one has all their hamstrings on too. So this is a very co-activated cat, and maybe this one's more athletic, and maybe this one's more scared. But even when we place them in different types of perturbations and different configurations that would have different energetically optimal patterns, they reverted to these same patterns. Okay, so this then convinced me that this is, or part of the reason convinced me that this was actually something that was in the nervous system and not something that's predetermined by the biomechanics of the movement. Because we try and change that as much as possible, and people have shown that actually people prefer these habitual solutions to movement rather than optimal ones.
When it comes to energy optimization, you are always looking at the minimization, right, of energy?
So yeah, usually that's what people do, is they minimize. Yeah. Yeah, that's sort of the standard thing in the field. So minimize the squared effort. And then the nice thing about the additive part, so the non-negative matrix factorization, so if we're only adding, then if I have features of coordination, I can't subtract them. So people always ask me why I don't use principal components. Well, if I have this pattern, it's there. You can't erase it. And one of the things it reveals is that here's a muscle, this hamstring muscle. I can, rather than saying it's correlated to these other muscles 50% of the time, I can be much more, I can make a stronger statement, which is that in certain directions, this muscle is activated with some other hamstrings, And in the 270 directions, it's definitely not activated with them, but co-activated with an extensor muscle. So I can partition the activity of the muscles here into two different actions that involve two different coordination patterns across muscles. We did this in humans too. And the interesting thing is that, again, for each person, we get their own set of modules. And when you look at trial by trial variability, so if I give you two perturbations in a row that are identical, the second one will not be as exciting. You're not going to respond as much. So you might have a really strong response and then a smaller one. And we can decompose those responses now by modulating these patterns. So the variability is not just noise. It's structured in variations of the command to particular modules over the others. And if you average these two types of behaviors, like what I call a hip strategy, and an ankle strategy, you'll get nonsense because they're fundamentally different patterns of muscle activation. And so we don't like to average. And then the other thing that's interesting is that you can then generalize these. Actually, this is kind of a cute result that we saw that the similar modules were used in balance and in walking, which I wouldn't necessarily have suspected, except that they're both these sort of subcortical activities. And so this generalization across multiple tasks, I think, is very important because once you learn to kick a ball for soccer, you want it to transfer over to football or kickball or whatever else you want to do with your leg. And in fact, we studied that. We studied ballet dancers for this reason because we wanted to see, how they're able to achieve these tasks. And so, you saw them walking on the narrow beam, and we showed that the motor patterns that they use when they're walking on the beam are very similar to what they use over ground. So we call these shared modules. Whereas the novices are not able to do that. But if we put the novices in a easier situation, so over a wide beam, then now they're actually using the same motor pattern. And this is actually counter to what the sports literature says, which is that you learn a skill and it's very specific to that movement. What we think is that you're taking, so walking's not very constrained. So there's lots of, like I said, you were all doing it differently, is that then I'm taking those modules and I'm sculpting them so that they can expand the range of tasks that they can do. And by default, it's going to change the way that a ballet dancer walks. And I think that that's something that we all intuitively can see, that a ballet dancer is different than a football player in how they move. Yes, question back there.
Can you speak to how that learned response is localized? Right? Is it again in the spine? Is it muscle? Right? Have you been able to?
I studied the humans. The one thing I can say is that we did look at people with Parkinson's disease, and their walking and balance were different. Okay, and remember I said people can't walk and talk at the same time, and the idea is now they're thinking about their walking. After they went through rehabilitation, which was tango dancing, their balance, which is this automatic response, and their walking modules became more similar. And so we think that that meant that the control of the walking was becoming more automatic.
Yeah. You all the time talking in terms of patterns of muscle movement.
Yeah.
So you say we learn certain patterns and then we use them for different functions.
That's right.
Do you think there's analog to this in cognitive activity?
Absolutely.
So I learn how to study a new language, and then I have another language, and can we have any evidence that similar things are happening on cognitive functioning and not just on muscle functioning? So
I do think so, and this is something I've been interested in. I haven't known how to do it, but I'm going to argue that, and also, so speech is also a motor pattern, right? And when we all have, people have different accents, and in your native language, when you project that onto a different language, you have a very reliable accent. So I think that's a similar phenomenon that we're seeing in ballet dancers when they walk, and football players when they walk. think I took that slide off, but I think that these sort of ways that we learn to both process sensory information and move are similar to the idea of cognitive bias, that when I am presented with a new situation, it's going to get filtered through my experience and my expectations. But if you'd like to talk about that, that's great, because I don't know how else to do it except by analogy. So, all right, so there's some work showing what I talked about before, is that babies are born with like 2 locomotor modules, and then they get 3, and then they get 4 as they age. So they did these studies of toddlers and children as they aged. And so basically, it takes time for us to learn our bodies. And let's see, this, I'm getting to the end. And so, so this idea that we're going to take these modules that we have and refine them to do other tasks, I call it backward compatibility. I have a task without many constraints, and then I want to generate basis functions that can also do tasks with more constraints. And that's sort of consistent with the idea that we're sharing these spinal circuits across behaviors, and maybe poses some constraints on the types of things that are easy for us to learn or difficult for us to learn, depending on how we started. One of the things I don't know is, when do you need to develop a new module? When is it beneficial to do that, or necessary to do that?
Do you have any, did you repeat the experiment with the novices enough times that they became an expert? Like, do you have any idea of how long it takes to become expert in that motor?
I don't know. I don't like to do training studies because it takes a long time. So anything that I do fights with what they do all the time, which is why, as a first pass, we're like, let's take the people we know are better than the other people. And then, but we did see evidence with the Parkinson's patients after they went through rehabilitation. Right, so that was 3 weeks intensive, 22.5 hours of tango dancing. And so this becomes very important when we're thinking about rehabilitation and how we're trying to retrain brains to move.
Do you think there might be some task that, so you have 2 separate individuals, and one of them sort of modifies an existing module to handle the new task, whereas the other one maybe creates a completely separate module?
So one of the things I didn't show you is that in different people we see different numbers, and I don't know if that's just because the task wasn't challenging enough. I do know that my student was on the Taekwondo team, and we saw a subset of people who, like, when we pushed them, they had this sort of lowering knee synergy that we hadn't seen in anybody else. And in the Parkinson's too, the idea is that when you intentionally practice things, that then they can actually change your automatic responses. So I think we see evidence of that. We haven't studied it any formal way to really see that.
I feel like I'm kind of getting at, you pretty much have 2 people who might go through different learning processes, but they're sort of behavioral phenotypes. Like, what they do is exactly the same, but their structure of modules is sort of different.
Yes. Yes, probably. And I think that is going to depend on where they start and where they go. And it also has issues for practice. So if you think about, there's a null space of solutions, right? And it's for one task it's here, and for another task it's here. Where you are in that manifold and how close it is to the intersection of the 2 is going to affect, how far do you have to change it? If it's close, it might be easy, but if it's far, it might seem like a different task to you. Right. But I don't know. I mean, these are things that I'd like to sort of explore computationally. All right, so the motor modules, and we're just looking at the very output layer of motor neurons, is, I think, sort of a control point to transform a very simple goal, right? This is like the lowest level goal of like moving your leg to the left, into muscle activity. And this is a really cool paper by Hewlings Jackson in 1889, where he said that just as many chords, musical expression, and tunes can be made out of a few notes. you see these re-representations of movements at different levels of the nervous system. Okay, and so I think that we're seeing evidence of that. And so I'm thinking about this as a stored repertoire of available motor actions, which allows very flexible motor behavior, and it actually allows you to compute, to actually not think about biomechanics at all. You see where I am. I think I'm at the end. So I'm not going to go over this, but like this is sort of how I think about the system as being symmetric, and a lot of the things we've talked about are dealing with interpreting sensory information, but I think there's sort of a symmetric system going the other way, but the information is asymmetric, so that makes it difficult for us. But what it means is that we can think about abstract goals and then implement them in biomechanics. And I have a whole bunch of work actually showing that that means that the temporal signals activating these spatial patterns of muscle activation are also low dimensional, but they're related to the task. So I'm going to skip over that. Right, so we have this, well, quickly, this very simple model. This is stupid, right? Inverted pendulum and 3 feedback gains with a delay, and I can predict with fine accuracy the muscle activity that I see across multiple muscles. And it's related to how the center of mass is moving. There's no sensor for the center of mass. That's my goal. And it works even if I have a very different sort of biomechanical system. So we didn't have to change the gains or anything to deal with lateral movements if we were activating these muscle synergies. So that is really crazy why a dumb model like this actually can describe a very complex behavior. So low dimensional adaptation. So back to this figure is just how I think about information is going through the nervous system, is that this structure here for controlling multiple muscles is recapitulated over and over and over. And the difference between the spinal cord and the brainstem and the cortex is how big it is and how many different things, how flexible, how many different things it can do. So one, how quickly you can change it, not very quickly in the spinal cord, and then how many different combinations you might be able to do.
I got a question.
Yep.
Quick one. Can you go back to the previous slide?
This one?
Yeah. Can you say what are you integrating there? Down at right-hand side. Could you say something?
Where?
On those variables, what are they?
These variables?
Yeah, down. No, down, all the way down to the right-hand side.
Oh, here. Okay, so what, we can talk about it later, but what all we did was we said we have a pendulum, we're going to move it like our platform, and then we want to minimize the amount of effort, the U, the activity, so the squared effort, and then this is basically performance, so how far away from the vertical. So it's the state of the system, and then there's a terminal constraint here to make sure you end up vertical. I might be no, the DT's in there, okay. So this was a trade-off between energy and performance. So basically, I think these sort of characteristic and constrained movements in individuals sort of emerge from the neuromechanical interactions that make us all have our individual patterns. And I'm gonna go here. So this is an interesting paper about modularity facilitating sort of robust adaptation and learning, where you can break things into subtasks. This is actually for visual identifying pixels, but you can also look at some generalization and across motor and sensory systems when we talk about these sort of modulation, fanning in and fanning out. And so this way you can change some of the network without affecting all of the behaviors of the network, which I think is you don't want to forget everything. You want to be able to modify pieces of the network. So this was a very intriguing paper to me where they were talking about adaptation over generations, but I think this also applies for a lot of different timescales. And one of the key things that they did was they included connection costs. So remember I said neurons are expensive and you don't want to have projections where you don't need them. So I think actually the energetics of neural computation itself is actually an important consideration as well. So here, I'm going to end with this. My brain computation wish list. What do I want to get out of this? Some improved ways for us to look at our data. So I think that there are more motor modules than muscles, but right now we can only extract fewer modules than the number of muscles we record from. If you think about it, I have N muscles. Even if they just go on and off, I have 2 to the N combinations. Most of them are crappy, which is why we have to remember how we move, right? Like our model, it falls down most of the time. So I'd like to explore also maybe some unsupervised learning of movement patterns, kinematics. So maybe it seems that these subtle differences in how we move actually do show up in something that's recognizable to people. And as you're probably a ballet dancer and you're probably a soccer player, but also you may have Parkinson's disease and you may be depressed. There are movement signatures across neurological and psychiatric disorders. And in fact, I go occasionally to neurology video club where they literally record people on their phones, and the older doctors train the younger doctors. Oh, no, that's not that kind of a tic. It's a different kind of tic. So there's information there, and I don't think we can label the data. We don't know what it is. And so I want the data to tell us what's different. I've talked to Gordon Berman at Emory he's been doing it with flies, with Tisney methods, T-stochastic, neighbor embedding. We can talk about it. But he's been able to map out behavioral spaces in animals. So I'd like to improve that some reinforcement learning thing I showed you. But as I said, I think we need to embed some of the principles that I told you that the nervous system has, which is learning simple things. We don't start with walking, learning simple things, and then having different learning rates across those levels, and to take into consideration dynamics, right? So that time matters. One thing I've been also interested in is control theoretic approaches to understanding, changes, the relative costs and benefits of changing my neural control versus changing my biomechanical system. So a simple example we've studied is you're riding on a bus. Are you going to tense up your muscles, or are you just going to take foot and stand like this? When I model that system and I do like a stability margin and using classical control theory, I can't actually compare those two systems because we always assume that the mechanics is the same. And so we've come up with some very basic ways to turn that into an eigenvalue analysis, which I don't have a student working on. But I just said, can't we talk about control, mechanical control versus neural control on the same, with the same metric, basically. So with that, here's some more food for thought. There's a book that came out this year on neurobiology of motor control. They did the editor actually edited, and they paired vertebrate and invertebrate people so that we would talk a little bit more about generalization rather than very specific systems. So that might be something that we want to do. And chapter 12 is about biomechanics. The rest is neural control. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
There's time for one or two quick questions before the break, if there are any.
So when you're talking about possible reaction, possible moments to achieve certain task, the solution space of the movement that kind of works is a kind of continuous solution space that maybe a few optima or other very discrete regions, and depending on which region you are in, you're not likely to get to that.
Yeah, it's very bumpy. We did some really silly, just try to span the space of just pushing, and try to really find the, characterize the stability versus cost. And it's an extremely bumpy space. It's very hard to search the whole space because there's so many minima all over the place. So we found that if we had a low activation, if you find the minimum energy one, it's easy to move away from that into something else that's slightly more stable. But if you've got a lot of high activation, it's very difficult to go to low activation. And the high activation is what we see in patients, actually. But yeah, it's really hard to put it into any kind of cost function or and searching. So, and that's another reason that I think that we have these individual differences, is because it's not easy to traverse the space. So if you find a solution that works, you want to stay there.
I think other questions can approach Lena during